The Vocation of Psychology. From Works on Nietzsche, first half of the 1950s. This infernal vocation of psychology, flectere sine quae superos, atrontum movebo. If I cannot make heaven bend, then I will raise hell. But if psychology must take the measure of hell, it is not defined by another path, the path which leads to Olympus. Rather, the measure of hell must be taken for itself. An arrow launched towards the night, towards the heart of the earth, not to explain the day, nor to do the geology of our landscapes, but to courageously and definitely make our way towards this nocturnal point where both the truth and the truth of man are abolished, where being itself is dead. The meaning that psychology must take today is the impossibility of philosophizing in the clear and serene space of an anthropology. We can only philosophize from night, by a leap from the abyss of non-knowledge, without recourse to man or humanist excuse. We can only philosophize once all the homelands are lost. An ambiguity, psychology, in its current historical roots, is entirely woven into the forgetting of this vocation. Its light is only made of the hidden night. Its light is only carried by its gaze, which turns away from this night. So it is by looking at the opposite of its gaze that we rediscover what it is moving away from. Psychology only indicates a philosophical task on condition of going against the grain. It is not by letting oneself slide with the flow of one's current that one finds oneself, through the silent and accomplished reduction of oneself, in the presence of a philosophical and radical questioning. Rather, it is useful, but only as long as we divert it from the intended use, bring into the full light of day this little core of negation that is positive, that is positive, that its positive, that is that its positivist affirmations have never ceased to mask. Psychology is ambiguous, not because it imports into its positivity the gnawing secret of a transcendental questioning, but because its meaning, it carries it in the opposite direction, and because its answers are the way, no doubt, to refuse this questioning, and because its light only aims to hide the seriousness of a night. These questions, should the cardinal orientation of a path towards philosophy necessarily be this counter-meaning of psychology? Is this only the determination of a moment in the destiny of our Western thought? Can the destruction of truth, the mortal wound of being, open only to those who return to the banks of man's knowledge? Now and always? It is quite probable that there is something historical here, for a thought which has not known the Western destiny, the opening occurs elsewhere and differently. The point of decay of the world is man. Our Western world is anthropological, to the extent that it asks for a truth of man, for an essence of man, for finally the being of man, to replace the crumbling truth, the essence engulfed, the being that bleeds, and to hide under a mastery of man by man, a disaster where something other than man is compromised. Psychology is the clearest profile of this anthropologization, the simplest, most derisory form of this mastery. Where does this anthropologization begin? Well before Kant's anthropology. Already Socrates preferred to question men. Since Phaedrus, trees are no longer the landscape of philosophy, but an ordered garden. The Christian God was only possible in an ancient world once the reign of anthropology had taken hold. And the most transparent form, the quintessence of this anthropology, is psychology, as a positive form of knowledge of man in his truth. Thus positivity, knowledge, and truth are linked in an element of an essence of man. To hide the fact that deep in a Western culture, deep in a Western consciousness, deep in Western man, there is a negativity of non-knowledge, that is, conflicts, diverse instincts, something altogether different, where both truth and man and their essence are undone. Thus, the historical repetition of culture, the reflection against the grain on the positive image that man gives himself in knowledge, the aesthetic experience in its creative task, the openness, finally, to the freedom of the political enterprise. These are all ways of exploding these postulates of anthropology. Without doubt, a full freedom of political enterprise or creation always tears the fabric of an anthropology. It is always an indicate of death to humanism. But to the very extent that they are not illuminated as such, they force an anthropology to be inaccessible, more secret, and more abysmal. They push anthropology even further into the heart of the world. And we need the historical repetition of culture, the reflection in reverse on the truth of man, in order to extract the truth from anthropology, and finally make possible a philosophy without man, a truth without knowledge, a knowledge without subject, a world whose face is without gaze, and art without face. This opening onto the night, this is the beginning of philosophy. It is also the philosophy of the beginning. This night is the philosophical beginning. It is the beginning of philosophy. And this in an unsurpassable and absolute way. As long as it does not begin on this night and through this night, then any question about the origin is impure. For example, the Hegelian interrogation on the moving surfaces of the day with which the phenomenology of spirit begins, or the Husserlian interrogation on the penumbra of the landscapes which open upon awakening, already flowing from consciousness, or the Heideggerian interrogation on the brilliance of Greek truth in the sunny opening of being. All these ways of questioning the beginning are impure. However early they may be, all of them begin after daybreak, whereas it is the hollow of night that must be questioned about as future suns. It is night that must be taken seriously, as origin and source, not the pallor, already too clear, of dawn. From the night flows the day, like springs from the earth. When appearance flees, when a full world, without a predicate yet, opens to my temporal flow. When presence shines on the illumination of being, the injustice of man already reigns, and with it, history. Only these philosophies have nothing to complain about if we try to circumvent them by following the paths of history. They have always left history behind in their own beginning. To begin philosophy is not, it cannot be, to take the sensible, the phenomenon, the experience, or the being at the level of their appearance, but to seek them where they are not. It is seeking to hear this cry: the sun in the middle of the night, man in the middle of the desert, truth in the networks of dreams, logos and madness. Thought must begin not where things point, but where they cannot grow. It does not begin in spring, but in the middle of winter. It is born in the ashes. Hence the meaning and necessity of criticism. Should philosophy not begin with destruction, with criticism, skepticism, moral and social criticism, Kantian criticism, anthropological criticism? So many ways of arriving at the residue, or the essential, or the a priori, i.e., to be able to start with something other than nothing, to make philosophy begin already. This is why criticism is never serious, either because it comes up short or because it does not ever end. Criticism is indeed the presupposition of philosophy, but not as a path that leads to the promised land, nor as prevention against all belief that allows one to achieve certainty. That is, criticism must not precede philosophy. It is enveloped in the beginning of philosophy. Criticism is simply the experience of the night, the experience that we do not have of the truth, the experience that being is wounded to death, the experience that all possible life has gone dormant. Criticism is this, the point where the vertigo of the discourse plunges, when it is not yet philosophy, but as soon as it has plunged, it is already philosophy. Criticism is only the critical point where philosophy begins. Taken strictly, it is the night that its beginning requires. It is in this light that psychology was born, as a psychology of error and not a psychology of truth, as psychology not of love but of perversion, as a psychology not of virtue but of passions, vices, and lies, as a psychology not of consciousness in its waking state, but of forgetfulness, unconsciousness, and sleep. It is originally designated not as man's path to his truth, but as a discovery of the path along which man tends to forget himself and lose himself until the end of his life. The first psychological emotion, I mean its first movement and its original pathos, is that of the subject with bad moral conscience. That is, its history begins with the bad moral content of thought. There's no point here in showing how a philosophy of evidence should indeed call for a psychology of the imagination, a metaphysics of intelligible space, a psychology of the natural judgments and perception, an ethics of bliss, a psychology of desire. Rather, the essential thing when it comes to identifying what reflection and research in psychology can be is to emphasize only that they are born in the space of play of a morality, or rather born in this movement by which man recognizes that he is not at home in the truth, that his gaze does not originally open unto being, that his speech does not carry in its form the language of truth. Thus, as a rediscovery of this homeland, a new look at the morning of truth, as a discourse that listens to this language, knowledge is the disappearance of psychology, the erasure of the distance in which it unfolds. Even metaphysics, as an accomplishment in the form of knowledge of what morally implies as its requirement, of what morality implies as a requirement, guarantees the effective disappearance of psychology. And therefore psychology is the provisional metaphysics of fallen man, the truth of his error, the nature which keeps him at a distance from the truth of nature. And what does it mean that psychology is the provisional metaphysics of fallen man? Let's return to the 17th century, to contrast psychology and philosophy. If psychology in Western 17th century thought is a set of concepts such as perversion and bad moral conscience that explain why metaphysics can be the most radical requirement of a morality, it is through psychology that the Christian ethics of fallen man was able to be accomplished and surpassed in a metaphysics of truth. And this is why metaphysics presents itself as the metaphysics of nature, as the rediscovered truth of what man has lost. And this in contrast to the philosophy of the 17th century. It is a philosophy of man before the fall, or after redemption, at home, compensated if out of place. It is in this anthem of man that philosophy is the suppression of psychology, which was the least anthropological philosophy that could be found. That is, psychology in the 17th century, far from being then what it will be later, which ensures the insertion of a philosophy in an anthropology, or of truth in the essence of man. Rather, it plays in philosophy the capital role of erasing man from the truth, in protecting philosophy against all kinds of anthropology. Thus, psychology is not a return to man, but the disappearance of man. Psychology in the 17th century, by removing itself from metaphysics, dissipates the face of man and the morning of truth.